All right, we are live now for part 2 of the residential purchase agreement. Welcome, everybody. I guess I could open it up and see if there's any questions from part 1. We are live now for part 2. Anybody have any questions from the last training we went through? And I hope you all did your homework and wrote a contract. Feel free to unmute yourself. All right, we got no questions, so we're going to get right into the next topic.
Did everybody get a chance to, go in and try and write a sample offer?
There was some thumbs up, Mark.
Oh, okay, good. I missed that. I saw a couple, one hand raised, but just as a side note, it's kind of surprising. Sometimes I have agents call me who have been around for a while and they're stumbling through, using the program. And that's the best way for you to learn how to use it, is just make a fake transaction and send the digital signature packet to yourself or to a friend and, see how the program works.
Better now than when you got a client. All right, I'm assuming we're going to go full screen on this.
Yeah, that worked well last time. I could see everything really well.
So let me get to the section that we started off or left off at. Section 12 addresses the buyer's ability to actually investigate the property and do inspection on it. And it discusses there's a contingency in place. So section 412A right here is a contingency of this agreement. So what is a contingency? I'm going to review. A contingency is something put into an agreement that a principal or a party will have the ability to do something or have something completed or get something initiated or whatever. And then if it basically allows them to get out of the contract if they decide they want to, because it's contingent upon them approving it. So in this contingency, it's about the buyer going in and looking and inspecting the property. And this is probably pretty important for you to discuss with your buyer about the ability to do that. The contract is templated in section 14B1 to 17 days to go through and do their inspections, etc. So once you get an offer in escrow, you're going to want to go to work right away, having the buyer investigate that property by hiring what we call a property inspector. Now, a property inspector will go through and inspect and give what's called a general inspection of the property, meaning they're going to look at the property overall and say, this is wrong, look at this, look at this. And within their report as well, they'll say something like, foundation has cracks and blah, blah, blah. Recommend secondary inspection. Well, just like going to a doctor, you go to your general practitioner to have the overall care. And if you have an issue, let's say with a heart or something like that, they'll send you to a heart doctor. So a general inspector doesn't do the intents, they do an overall. And when you do come up as representing a buyer and the secondary inspector says, recommend foundation expert, recommend roofing expert, recommend plumbing expert. The conversation you should have with the buyer is, this is your choice. You're buying the house and your primary inspector said that they recommend you go and look at other stuff. Whether they do it or not is another story, but you need to guide them into that direction. So 12A covers the general physical, the wood destroying pest, those are termites, inspect for lead-based paint, and satisfy any needs that's within the buyer inspection advisory, which we'll cover at the end of this. Review the Megan's Law database, confirm that they can actually get insurance on the property. Insurance is a big deal right now, especially if the home is in what we call a fire zone. If that home is in an area that has burned down a lot in the last decade, you got to make sure that you can actually get insurance on the property. So they have to investigate that. This has put the onus on the buyer to go do that. And then the buyer also needs to review and seek approval all the leases that may be assumed by the buyer. Let's say a solar panel, or maybe a lease on a water softener, or anything that's going to remain with the property. That's their investigation. Can they assume those leases? Section B covers that the seller, so this is now in the contract, the seller has to make the property available for the buyer to do all that, so that they can come in and do it. The seller can't say, no, you can't come in. No, the contract says I need to come in. And give the seller at no cost complete copies of all such those investigation reports obtained by the buyer. So if you do get a report, this section does say, yes, give that report to the seller. Section C covers that the seller has to have all the water, gas, electricity, and all operable pilot lights on for the buyer's investigations and through the date possession is made available to the buyer. Through the date possession, so the day it's no longer the seller's property, it's the buyer's responsibility. Side note, this is one thing that's missed a few times, where buyers forget to call SDG&E or whatever services they need to make sure that there's power the day they move in. So kind of put that in your tickler file when you're representing a buyer, to remind them to actually call SDG&E and get power in their name, power and gas. Also, if you're representing the seller, remind them, hey, you need to call the power company and let them know you're moving. Because once the power company knows that the seller's moving, then it's okay for the buyer to assume stuff. We have had instances where buyers move into properties on a Friday because they didn't get power and there is no power, and they go through the weekend with no gas or electricity. Section D, buyer indemnity and seller protection for entry upon property. So this section basically covers the protection for the seller, that the buyer is going to come into the property, but they're going to hold the seller harmless if the buyer falls and breaks their leg. So a typical scenario, like homeowners will have a homeowner insurance. And if you have anybody that comes on your property and they actually injure themselves, they could make a claim against their homeowners and the seller's homeowner policy. Well, this will indemnify the seller of that responsibility, because they're basically saying, here, you're coming on to inspect the property, but you got to be careful. And if you fall, it's not our fault and you can't come after us. And then anybody else that, and this is a rarity, and if it ever does happen, you need to reach out to me or Mark, because we need to guide you through this. But let's say prior to close of escrow, the buyer wants to make a repair to the property so that it's ready when they move in. And in some cases, a seller will allow it. But that buyer has to bring in what's called a contractor. And the contractor is going to do the repairs. Well, there's a certain form that needs to be filed. It's called a notice of non-responsibility, that basically the seller would need to file with the city entity they're in and put a notice on the property that if you have a contractor coming on the property to fix something, we're not responsible if they hurt themselves. Any questions on that?
Yes, I have a quick question. For the inspector, are they on the list of verified vendors that we have at our disposal? If we need to, if they ask us for a referral of an inspector?
So in your real estate practice, it is always a good practice to have inspectors and home warranty and lawyers in your back pocket. However, that said, you should always give them you can provide them a list of inspectors that you've used in the past, but there's a caveat. The caveat is that you should not say you have to use this person. They're the best.
Mhm.
You should say, here's who I've used in the past and my company's used in the past. They're great. And if you need sources to look to find other inspectors, I'll give you a source to go look for that. Here's why. Let's say that inspector, for whatever reason, the buyer makes a claim after close of escrow that the inspector missed something really big. And then that buyer / new homeowner wants to go back and sue that inspector. Well, they could also make a claim against you because you referred them to that inspector. So you always got it. You can give referrals, but you give the referral with, and we also recommend that you also, here's a list of other sources to find inspectors to work with. Does that answer your question, Aida?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Section 13 talks about title investing. So title is a legal document that shows who's going to own the house, and really the simplest way of putting it. And so there's going to be what's called a preliminary title report that the buyer is going to get. They're going to look at it. And basically the title will show all the information the assessor have, et cetera, and who has a lien against the property. Are there any encumbrances? Are there any loans? And the buyer needs to look at that. And then also in section B, it talks about how the buyer is going to take title into the property. And escrow will work with them on that. They'll give them certain ways. You'll never tell them how to take title. You need to make sure that they make their own decision, again, because you're not a title expert. But it does say in section B that the buyer's taking this property free of any liens or encumbrances on the property. And it's subject to all those easements, covenants, conditions, restrictions, rights, and other matters, whether of record or not, as the date of the acceptance. C talks about the seller's responsibility to disclose anything affecting title. So you'll hear the phrase, a cloud on title. A cloud on title could be something that, like a lien, or maybe a last minute tax lien pops up. And the seller has the duty to disclose that per the agreement. And then section D, at the close of escrow, buyer shall receive a grant deed conveying that title to that buyer. And the manner of taking title may have significant legal and tax consequences. Consult the appropriate professional, which is not you. It's not you, the real estate agent. And then the buyer is going to receive a homeowner's policy of title insurance. And for the coverage, recommend that the buyer speak with the title company about what's covered, what's not covered. We do occasionally have a title class in the office. It's about it's good as watching paint dry. You should know the ins and the outs, but you can also refer them to a title officer for them to go more of a deep dive. Don't be the expert on the title report. 14 is about time periods and removal of some of those contingencies we've talked about previously, and then cancellation rights. Again, they're all templated, but they can be extended, altered, or modified or changed by mutual agreement. 14A gives the timeline that the seller, after date of acceptance, to deliver to buyer all the reports that were specified in paragraph 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, and 13. And if the seller has not done that, according to what the timelines are, then the buyer's agent with the buyer should submit a form called NSP, which is a notice to seller to perform. So once you open up escrow, if you've never gone through escrow, you think it took a lot to get to that, to even find the buyer, to even get into escrow and find the home. you're going to do a lot of work through escrow as well too. You'll get systems set up and procedures put in place for all this, but once you get through escrow, now you got to get to the finish line. And Mark, feel free to pipe in anytime.
I was just going to say somewhere in discussing section 14, we touched on this briefly in the previous session about if you have a shortened escrow period, less than 30 days, or which is typically normal. Let's pretend, you're working with someone like the cash buyer. It's a builder, a flipper, renovator, whatever. And they say, well, we'd like to close in 10 days. We're going to pay all cash for the property. Well, guess what? You have to modify these terms in 14A, B, C, and so forth, because the default terms 7 and 17 days are based on a 30-day escrow. If you have a 10-day escrow, you have to shorten all those time periods. So keep that in mind if you ever run into that you can't just say it's a 10-day escrow and leave the rest of the sections on the purchase agreement as is. They need to be adjusted as well.
And B1 talks about those timelines for the buyer. So it's templated to 17 days that the buyer goes in and does their investigations on what we discussed in paragraph 12.
We might
So how the
also
buyer goes in and does those investigations.
We might also include in 17B that those that those disclosures that have to be given to the buyer include the buyer's agent's AVID. You can't wait until the 29th day of escrow to do your AVID.
Section 2 talks about the time frame that the buyer has the and I'm not going to say the right, but the ability to request that seller make repairs, submitting the form RR. That's great. But here's the part I want you to know. Seller has no obligation to agree to or respond to the buyer's request. But if they did, they use the form RRRR. So just remember, when you're writing an offer for a buyer and they start talking about, well, we're going to ask the seller to do this and this and this. I'm like, we will ask them, but know that they have no responsibility to respond to you. They don't have to. And we do get that a lot. We get that a lot from people asking, Broker Bob, my buyer's asking for repairs from the seller and they're not replying. I'm like, well, they don't have to. What did you tell your buyer? And 9 times out of 10, they told their buyers that they can get repairs asked for. So don't make that mistake. Big mistake first-year agents will make is guaranteeing that buyers can ask for repairs. Especially in this market. We have 2,200 homes for sale in San Diego County right now. That's not a lot. Sellers are giving the buyers the middle finger right now. Like, you want my home? Overpay for it, and I'm not doing jack. So 13 talks about the timeline when the seller, once they deliver to the buyer all the disclosures in a report, how long does the buyer have to look at it? Well, they have 5 days after they get delivered any item. So all those forms up there, the reports, leases, documents, the disclosures, everything. You got 5 days. So a seller needs to get those reports delivered to the buyer pretty quick if they want to make timelines. And let's say it's the 15th day and the buyer has 17th day to remove that contingency per section B1 up here. Well, if it's a 15th day, they get a report, they still have 5 days. So they can stretch it all the way out to the 22nd day because the seller was remiss on getting them information needed. 4 talks about continuing those contingencies, in other words, extending them out. They can be continued, but it has to be mutual agreement. In other words, the buyer just can say, we want to extend the amount of time we want to look at something. But seller has to notice and send that notice to buyer to perform prior to the contingency removal date to make, because that's what starts the clock. And then 5 talks about access to the property. Buyer shall have access to the property to conduct investigations and inspections for 17 days after acceptance. Okay? Whether or not the buyer's investigation contingency has been removed or not. After the 17th day, the seller doesn't have to let the buyer back in. You know, if they've done all their reports, they've gotten all their stuff, the seller can say, you can't come back in until the you need to do your final walkthrough. C talks about removal of contingencies with offer. Buyer removes the contingency specified in the attached contingency removal form. So let's say you want to remove certain contingencies, you would check this box right here and attach a form CR. But you need to make sure that if you have a buyer that wants to do that, that they have an adequate understanding, so you need to counsel them. Section D talks about the seller's right to cancel. So a buyer and a seller have a mutual agreement and a fully executed contract. It is harder for the seller the seller cannot unilaterally cancel. The buyer is the only one that can do that in the contract. A seller, if they want to cancel, has to follow certain steps. So I'll make this as simple as I can rather than going through and reading it. Let's say, and the reason why you don't want the seller to be able to cancel unilaterally, because if we allow that in real estate, then sellers would be doing that all the time to buyers because maybe somebody came and offered them $20,000 more. So it's really kind of hard for a seller to cancel an escrow unless they follow certain things. They have to send a notice to buyer to perform if the buyer is failing to perform on certain elements of the contract. That's the first step they have to do. And then after they send a notice to buyer to perform, then and only then can they send a cancellation of contract to escrow. So the notice to buyer to perform is what puts the buyer on notice to follow the terms of what they agreed to. And if they don't, that can give the seller the ability to cancel. Doesn't mean it will. And if you ever get into a situation like that, you are definitely going to be talking to me and Mark to guide you through that. The notices to buyer or seller to perform is covered in section E, and it basically outlines that you'll see 2 days in there, 2 days after delivery. So the 2 days after delivery means that once a buyer or seller has that notice to buyer to perform, and that buyer or seller has not performed, that allows either party to move forward, and either the seller could cancel the agreement after the second day. So that's where those timeframes hit. F, the effect of buyer's removal of contingencies. This paragraph kind of discusses once a buyer removes their contingencies, what does that effect have to do on their ability to cancel or get their deposit back? And I've seen all scenarios happen in that. So I'm not going to say this is the way it is. It's never the way it is in the contract. The law is free of reason. Then G discusses close of escrow. Before buyer or seller may cancel this agreement for failure of the other party to close escrow, they have to send the notice to buyer or seller form, and then after that, they can then send a demand to close escrow. But then there's 3 days after delivery of that they are required to close escrow. And section H talks about the effect of cancellations on the deposits. So I'm going to be just like real life scenario here. What it says here isn't always how it appears. So I will say, this. You will never guarantee a buyer or seller that they will get the deposit. I just want to make sure you understand that. Never guarantee them. Because I have seen every scenario play out this year, especially last year during COVID, where I felt a buyer was completely within their rights to get their full deposit back, but the seller dug their heels in, and they all ended up going to mediation. So this is supposed to cover the effect on cancellation on deposits, but the best way for me to explain it is never guarantee anything in real estate. Do you agree with that, Mark?
Yeah, it's up to someone who tries the facts. It's called a trier of fact, whether that's a mediator or whatever, and yet they're unpredictable. You can't say with certainty this is how it's going to happen.
15, final verification of condition. So you as the buyer's agent are going to take this buyer into the property within 5 days prior to close of escrow. And you're going to check a few things. That the property's in the same condition it was when you made the offer. That if you had any repairs that was agreed upon, they've been completed as agreed. And that the seller has complied with seller's other obligations under this agreement. And you're going to fill out a form that's called the VP, which is verification of property condition. And that becomes a part of your contract documents.
I have two things to add to this section. One is that if there's a seller remaining in possession in the purchase agreement, the verification of property condition needs to be done 5 days prior to close of escrow, just as it states here. It's not done at the end of the seller in possession period. The seller in possession form, whether that's the SIP or the RLAS, addresses property condition during that license or leaseback. The other thing I'd like to add here is when you're completing this VP, there's a big section, big blank section in the form that says where you're supposed to note any exceptions. And probably 50% of them I see are blank. And the other 50% say nothing noted, or property is in the condition expected. It's better, in my opinion, to add something there like no exceptions, or property is in the same condition as the time of purchase, whatever the statement is, rather than leave it blank. So.
That it?
Yep, on that.
Sorry, I'm taking care of some brokerage stuff on the back end. 16, Mark, can you go in and recover repairs for me? I got to deal with some stuff.
So essentially 16, repairs shall be completed prior to final verification of condition unless otherwise agreed to in writing. So there's, a lot of people think, oh, we have to have everything done beforehand, and it doesn't always work out that way. So repairs can be performed, after close of escrow, before, that type of thing. Again, this section's pretty much self-explanatory. It explains what sellers have to do and what they don't have to do. So just read through it, and again, if this comes up as an issue, this is your guide to instruct the buyer of what needs to happen and when.
Here's one thing that's missed a lot is this section right here. Seller shall obtain invoices and paid receipts for repairs performed by others. Prepare a written statement indicating the repairs performed by seller and the date of such repairs, and provide copies of invoices and paid receipts and statements to buyer prior to final verification of condition. In my real estate practice, when I represent a listing and a buyer asks for repairs and the seller agrees to it, and whatever the repair is, we will make copies of the receipts to prove that the repair was made and who made it, and then provide that as to the other side. That is lacking in today's world. I don't see a lot of that happen right now, unfortunately.
Especially with renovators or flippers that have purchased a property and fixed it and are reselling it. sometimes those contracts will even state that the seller will not provide those receipts for work that was conducted on the property.
And you bring up a good point. If you represent a buyer in a flip property, you know, we're talking about a home that is lipstick on a pig. It might look pretty on the outside, but underneath there's a whole host of stuff that's wrong with it. And flippers will cut corners, and all of a sudden you find a laundry list of stuff in your inspection that needs to be repaired. So know this: if you have a flipper, a buyer that's buying a property from a flipper, and the flipper is says they're going to take care of it, you need to consult with me first, because I'll tell you the nightmares of some agents with flippers, that they are at the 11th hour trying to get everything fixed or at least started, and the flipper hasn't even started on it. 17 talks about prorations of property taxes and other items.
Hey, Robert, before you go on to that, Kelly has a question in chat, and she's asked, so what do you do in that case? Sometimes they use a handyman instead of a licensed contractor. Well, in my view, it's an agreement between buyer and seller as to who is going to conduct the repair. If they agree a handyman can do it and it doesn't need to be a licensed professional, they can agree to that, but they have to do so in writing, probably in the RR or the RRRR. A buyer can say that they want the work to be only done by a licensed contractor. And frankly, it depends on what the work to be done is. So it has to be, the simple answer to your question, Kelly, is it has to be by agreement of the parties.
Yes. Okay, section 17 talks about the proration of property taxes, basically. This section basically says the seller is going to be responsible for all the property taxes or assessments on the property until it closes escrow. And then there's also going to be something what's called a supplemental tax bill. A supplemental tax bill is what's going to come to the buyer after close of escrow, usually about 6 to 8 months after close of escrow. And it's the additional amount of property tax that would have been paid in the tax year based upon what the assessed value was when the seller owned it, and the new value of their purchase price if it was higher. So let's say the assessed value on the property was $500 when the owner sold it to the buyer, and then the new purchase price is $750. Well, there's $250,000 difference in an assessment that will adjust, and that bill will go to the buyer based upon the tax year that the buyer is in on that property. So that's the easiest way to explain it. You could just have the buyer go to the county tax collector website, and I think they have a special assessment estimator calculator on there. So like the BRE and the RLA I talked about, if you were to write a job description for the broker, basically the agent, this is the exact same thing. It discusses compensation. In other words, the brokers will be compensated at close of escrow, but then the scope of duty and what they agree to that the brokers do and don't do. So that's a big list. I want you to go through that as part of your homework and read through that. But it also says what you're not supposed to do. Again, you're not a you're not a legal person. You're not a tax person. You're not a permit. You're not a construction. You don't guarantee anything. So the less you know, the better. So you need to know, though, where they can get that information if they have questions about stuff like that. 19, representative capacity again. If one or more parties is signing this agreement in a representative capacity, then you're going to attach the form RCSD. So again, remember the very first question we asked a buyer if they were going to buy the property in the name of a trust, then that's the form that you will use to incorporate into the agreement, the RCSD-B.
So the other place where that comes into play, where representative capacity is not just a trustee of a trust. If a member of a limited liability company is acting and buying on behalf of an LLC, that's representative capacity. An officer of a corporation who's buying for the corporation, that's a representative capacity. And a person who holds a power of attorney for another person, that also falls into that category. So you have basically 4 different types of representative capacity that can be at play in a purchase agreement.
20 is basically the joint escrow instructions to escrow holder. So this is basically what the escrow holder is going to do, or the escrow officer. This is their instructions. Pretty boring stuff. But basically they have 3 days. You have 3 days to get all this information to the escrow holder after acceptance, and it gives the authorization to the escrow. But you're going to get it to them the next day because there's timelines that need to be met, like putting the earnest money in. All right. 21, remedies for breach of the contract. So this is going to outline if either party breached this agreement. This is for buyer or seller. So there's 2 ways for them to dispute. But know this, when it comes to that deposit again, you're never going to guarantee to the buyer they're going to get it back. You don't use language like that. But Section 21 discusses what's called liquidated damages, and also the when a buyer will not get it back. So in the state of California, there's something called liquidated damages that the buyer is limited to 3% of the purchase price. And anything above that shall be returned to the buyer, basically. So if the buyer breaches the agreement and they did not complete the sale, the seller has the right to retain 3% of the purchase price if that buyer did definitely breach the agreement, but no more than that. How do you do that? You go through, and let's say the buyer wants the deposit back and the seller's not giving it to them, or there was one other party did something different, then the way they dispute that out is they go to what's mediation or arbitration. Mediation is the first step. And if you ever get to a point like this, you're obviously going to be calling me, so I help guide you through it. But this is where either party invokes mediation to iron out their disputes they're having. So mediation is an independent third party that will get the groups together to work out their differences. And if they're unable to go through that, then they can go to what's called arbitration. Arbitration is where there's an independent third party, usually a retired judge or a justice or an attorney, that actually makes the decision based upon the laws as they interpret it. And it's binding, meaning whatever the arbitrator lays down in that session, then it's binding. You can't just go to any place else. Mark, you want to say anything on this?
Well, yeah, I do. In regard to arbitration, it's binding on the parties and it's not appealable. So it's rare that disputes, get to this level and actually go to arbitration. Usually they're resolved informally or through mediation. But know that if it is arbitration, it is binding and there's no appeal process. The other thing that's interesting about Section 21 and 22 is that they're elective sections. The parties have to mutually agree to them or mutually disagree to them. And what that means, simplistically, is that both buyer initial and seller initials have to be initialed. If one is and the other isn't, it's not an agreement. So, and again, it's an elective section. So when you're preparing a digital signature envelope, these fields are not automatically filled in, if my memory serves. That may be different now, but since it's an elective section, you have to go through this and actually place your buyer's initial field on that section. And this is one of the things I see in doing reviews many times is the offer will be sent over to the seller or to the listing agent, and the counter offer will come back and it'll say buyer agrees to initial section 21 and 22. Well, it's because the buyer's agent didn't put the buyer initial fields in these two sections.
I think it's the liquidated damages portion. I think that one is the only one elected in the form or DocuSign, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure either.
I could be wrong, but I think that's where it is.
It's just a matter of scrolling through the purchase agreement when you're doing the digital signature envelope creation just to see. But again, both have to be initialed or not initialed.
I guess if I was to give you the simple answer about what this page is about right here, this whole page is about what happens when one of the parties fails to perform. What are the steps for remedying it? And without going into the step-by-step process, because again, every situation is different, but this kind of lays out what happens if either party breaches the agreement. $23. Did I skip something? Okay.
No, you're good. 23 is next.
Selection of service providers. This is our safety mechanism for not guaranteeing what the escrow, title, home warranty, all those people are. But so brokers don't guarantee the performance of any vendor, service, or product providers, whether referred by the broker or selected by the broker, seller, or other person. So that's what we were talking about, the property inspector. You can give them names, but don't guarantee their performance. 24 discusses the broker's authorization to report the pending sale and close of escrow sale to the multiple listing service. Once the escrow closes, once a property closes escrow. 25, attorney fees. This is pretty much in every agreement, every contract. Basically says, hey, if we're going to go sue each other, whoever is proven wrong is going to pay the other person's attorney fees. 26 talks about assignment. Assignment means somebody wanting to assign their right in the contract to somebody else.
Yeah,
Well,
this is one of those things that we talked about at the onset of the first session on the purchase agreement, where you're asking the buyer, how do you intend to, purchase this? Do you want to hold it as, or, purchase as an individual? Do you want to purchase as a trust? Because sometimes it comes up in the middle of the transaction. And this is exactly what we're talking about. The process of adding a buyer or replacing a buyer is an assignment. And the seller does not have to agree to the assignment. Typically they do, but a total or partial assignment also requires the new added buyer or the replacement buyer to sign all the documents again, everything. It's a lot of extra work. So some sellers won't agree to it. So it's prudent for agents to ask buyers up front what their plan is as far as how they want to hold the title.
Where in this one little paragraph or sentence I highlighted, such consent shall not be unreasonably withheld. The scenario that we're talking about is if somebody wants to put it in the name of a trust. What this paragraph really helps protect is that a buyer that is a straw buyer for a company that all of a sudden they want to assign it to this company that's going to do something to the house for whatever reason, the seller doesn't have to agree to that. And where they're called real estate wholesalers. So we see that a lot you'll see that a lot sometime, or you'll see that occasionally in this market. A wholesaler is just coming in to make money on the property and then sell it to someone else as soon as they close escrow on it. That's what a wholesaler is.
Or before they close escrow, for that matter.
Or yeah, or before too, right? 27, equal housing opportunity. It's sold in compliance with all federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws. So again, equal housing is a full class that I teach, usually, and then usually discuss it at risk management. But who are the protected classes? And there's 26,
22, I think.
22 in the state of California. 28 terms and conditions. This is the offer. And it's an offer to purchase the property. And then all buyers and sellers have read the offer and any addendums. 29 times of the essence. This is usually in every contract. Time is of the essence. To me, what it means, how do I explain it? What it says is time is of the essence. Oh, the best way is this: neither this agreement nor any provision in it may be extended, amended, modified, altered, or changed, except in writing signed by buyer and seller. So in other words, the timeframes in the contract are timeframes that you're going to follow, and you can't change it arbitrarily. You can't just say, well, we want 2 more days to inspect the property as the buyer. You have a time frame of 17. And then 30 is actually something you guys should read all of these. These are the definitions in the contract. And the most important ones that I deal with the most is days and day after. Because everybody will always call me Broker Bob. If it says that I have 2 days to, when does the time frame start? Well, it depends on what portion of the contract, whether it reads days or days after. So know that days means calendar days. However, after acceptance, the last date for performance and ready act required with this agreement, including close of escrow, shall not include a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holidays, and shall instead be the next day. And then days after means the specified number of calendar days after the occurrence of the event specified, not counting the calendar date of which the specified events occur. So where does days after come into play? Well, we talk about 3 days after fully executed agreement that the buyer delivers to escrow the earnest money deposit. So today is the 21st. Let's say you get a fully executed agreement today. And then 3 days after is when the buyer has to have the earnest money to escrow. When should it be there by? Well, tomorrow would be day 1, right? Saturday's day 2 and Sunday's day 3. But it falls on a weekend, right? So because it falls on a weekend, then it needs to be there by Monday. $31 covers the expiration of the offer. It's automatically templated to expire 3 days after it's been delivered to the seller. So it automatically expires. So after 3 days, this offer is no longer good. And if it's within the 3 days, and then the buyer decides they want to withdraw the offer, they would use a form called WOO, which is Withdrawal of Offer. They can also shorten the time frames. Let's say you want to get the seller to give you a response right away. You can put in 2 days after the date on the agreement, or on a specific date. Okay. Right here, one or more buyers is signing this agreement as a representative capacity. So again, that purchase in the name of a trust, you would check that box and then incorporate the RCSD-B, because you're purchasing in the name of the trust, and they need the RCSD-B to validate who has the capacity or authority to sign on behalf of the trust. And you will need not to see the whole trust. You'll need to see the abstract of trust. It's basically the page that shows who has authority to sign on behalf of the trust. And Mark, so help me out on this one. So
We talked about, excuse me, we talked about additional signature addendum. And essentially that is a form that's used like if you had multiple buyers or sellers. And you may recall that we talked about I think with the listing agreement, it's better to just squeeze those signatures into this print name field for the buyer and have them sign, because the ASA form, it's not a great form because it requires the use of another ASA form for every document being signed. So it's much easier just to, tweak the digital signature process and have multiple buyer names on the spaces that are available here rather than to use the ASA form. But that's what the intent of that form is.
because the offer allows you to put in 4 buyers.
Yeah.
Didn't it?
Yeah, I believe it does.
But it doesn't have 4 buyers' signatures.
Right, and that you would have to squeeze them in the digital signature process. You'd have to manually place them. They wouldn't automatically be listed here.
So anybody have any questions on that? Okay. And then 32 is the acceptance of offer. If the seller agrees to the offer, they would sign here. But if they agree to the offer, but they want to send what's called a counter offer, they're going to check this box right here, and seller's acceptance is subject to the attached counter offer. And so whatever that counter offer is, will outline the terms of what they want to counter out. So in other words, they're going to accept everything in the contract but X, Y, Z. Maybe purchase price, maybe they'll clarify home title and escrow, whatever they want to counter out.
The important words here in this section 32 are subject to. In other words, the buyer's basically, making an offer, and that is what's stated on the purchase agreement. And then if the seller is going to counter, they're going to say, well, we accept everything that you've said in the purchase agreement except these items, or subject to these items. So this is why in the contract form process, you have a purchase agreement as let's call it the top level document, and then maybe get let's just say one counter offer. But the purchase agreement has to be signed in addition to the counter offer. And then the very last document in the series, let's pretend it's just one counter offer, that then the confirmation of acceptance section is signed. Like in the screen we're looking at right now, the only time that confirmation of acceptance paragraph would be initialed is if there were no counter offers. And it just says that right there. Do not initial if making a counter offer.
Next section is if the seller is going to sign this and send it back, but it's in the name of a trust, then they're going to incorporate the RCSD-S. So that's a representative capacity for the seller that they vetted on their end. You don't need to see that trust or the abstract of trust. That listing agent already has. But they're going to incorporate that into the agreement because it is in the name of a trust. And then the seller's 2 sections for the seller to sign. Same as the buyer. If there's 3 sellers, they'll probably squeeze in the 3. And this section right here will be sent back and initialed back to the buyer's agent. Let's say you're in a multiple counteroffer situation. Is that correct, Mark?
No, this would if the seller was completely in agreement with all the terms that the buyer has proposed on the offer, they could initial this section. Okay, but the buyer, the seller would accept it. They're not making a counteroffer. The buyer or the buyer's authorized agent could initial the confirmation of acceptance section and the contract is formed. If there is going to be a counteroffer, then the box above would have been checked by the seller and saying, you know, we're subject to this SCO or SMCO.
I'm sorry, you've covered this and I've had a brain aneurysm.
That's okay.
Next section outlines the real estate broker, and this is basically the cooperating broker compensation. This whole section needs to be filled out in its entirety. Do not send this over if you have not done the research to see who the selling broker is if you're representing the buyer, and fill out their DRE numbers and input it into this section, including their mailing address and their telephone number if you have it. It's just going to make everybody so much easier, especially escrow, because they're going to use this page when they start sending out information to you guys. This is where they're going to pull their primary information from.
And it's not hard. This information's right in the MLS printout. So you can just copy and paste it from Paragon into these fields if you need to.
And then once escrow receives the earnest money, they're going to fill out this section right here, just the page 10 of the agreement. And they're going to email you just this page 10 with their confirmation that the earnest money's been in. Presentation of offer and rejection of offer. So the presentation offer is really important if you're, especially if you're a listing agent right now, to let the buyer's agents know when their offer was presented, whether or not their offer is rejected by the seller. It's a good industry standard of practice to actually do that, to prevent the appearance that you did not present your offer to the seller, or it wasn't presented. So, and Mark, I'm forgetting, which one was obligated to send back? The presentation, right? But not the rejection?
A listing agent has a duty to present to the seller all the offers that they receive. So it's a good idea for this section to be completed on the form.
The presentation part, but the rejection wasn't required. Isn't that what they did on that car Friday call? Maybe I'm
I'm not recalling that.
Okay. Well, this is the section for you as buyer's agents to ask the listing agent for you to get that back if your offer was rejected, would be these two sections. The BIA we covered in the BRE class. So I will not be.
It was also, this BIA is also addressed in that section that you were talking about today on the buyer's responsibilities to investigate. This form is referenced in that section.
Yeah. So I did talk about this in the BRE class, but if you didn't get the BRE, what I will say here, if you're just going straight to the purchase agreement with your buyers, then you need to discuss the importance of the BIA when you write the contract with them. And basically it says, hey, you're buying a house. We recommend you get the house inspected. We want you to look at this, 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 this. So it's important. This is probably like the bit of homework I would give the buyer. I say, I want you to read through this because you're buying a house and this is what we recommend you inspect. For a more detailed understanding of it, go back and re-look at the BRE class. We discussed the Consumer Privacy Act advisory. And that is it. All right, Mark, any questions now on the RPA? Now, Mark, what did you want to pull up?
Why don't we look at a seller counteroffer? But before you go off of that screen, I would like to just point out that a zip form tip. When you have a form that you see in this menu, and it has that highlighted bar on it, that means that the form is in your transaction already. The ones that are not highlighted have not yet been added. So just a tip that if it's highlighted, it's already in your transaction.
Good tip, Mark. You want the counter? So I'm gonna let you run with this. Do you want the counter offer or the SMCO?
This one's fine. There's just a couple things on here. You'll probably see a counter offer. Maybe if you've had a good engagement or court conversation with the listing agent, and they're interested in your buyer buying the property and so forth, then you may not even have a counter offer. So I always talk to agents and I say, well, let me back up and say, sometimes I'll review transactions and I'll see there's like 5 counter offers. And I think to myself, these people are not talking to one another, the buyer's agent and the listing agent. They're just preparing forms and sending them back and forth. And the receiving party's going, that's no good. I don't want it. We don't agree to that. Why not talk to the listing agent? And would this be acceptable to your seller? Could they live with 15 days seller in possession instead of 20 days? Negotiate it over the phone or in an email before you actually prepare the form and send it over. So in completing this form, you basically put a date on it, and then you say this is a counter offer to typically the purchase agreement, or it would. This is the buyer's agent perspective, so you would have received this and it would have said that purchase agreement. And then in section 1C, you list, like we spoke about a minute ago, the exceptions to the purchase agreement. So the seller's basically saying in section 1C, we agree with everything that you said in your purchase agreement offer, buyer, except what they list in 1C. And then they might put something in like seller to remain in possession for 10 days. Well, this frequently, I see this missed. They should really check the box in 1D and attach the SIP form and send that over to you. Because as we spoke about earlier in the previous session, it's one thing to list or for the parties to agree to some situation like a seller remaining in possession, but the form related to that defines all the specifics. So that should be section 1D should be completed. So from a buyer's agent perspective, basically what you want to do is review these items, review them with your buyer and say, look, they're countering and they're saying that they would like this price instead of the offer price, or they would like the escrow period to be 25 days instead of 45 days, whatever they might be. So then your buyer has an opportunity to say, well, we don't want to do anything, we don't respond, and it's dead. It dies right there. If they want to say, well, that's okay, we want to proceed, and all of those terms are acceptable, your buyer could sign the counter offer and accept it. Or they can say, we accept everything in section 1C except number 3. So you can craft these counter offers to accept some of the terms and not others. What you don't need to do when you're preparing a response to a seller counter offer or seller multiple counter offer is relist everything that they've put in 1C in your buyer counter offer. I see that happen sometimes, and I'm like, well, if you're in agreement with it, there's no reason to relist it. Well, the only thing that you're listing on your buyer counter offer are things that the buyer doesn't agree to that the seller has proposed.
And then the difference between a seller counter offer and an SMCO, that means they're countering back to multiple people, not
Right.
just your offer.
And it's a good point to make, is that, you know, you receive an SMCO and it's an indication that there's competition. If an SMCO is used in error, in other words, a listing agent uses an SMCO and there is no other offer except yours, guess what? That's an ethics violation, but that's another story. But the SMCO indicates to you and to your buyer that they have competition. And so, you know, the conversation you need to have with them is, we need to really sharpen our pencil here and make sure we give the best response possible.
I have a question with that. So the SMCO means there's multiple other counteroffers,
No, it means there's multiple buyers.
multiple buyers. So
Right.
does that also indicate that there are possibly other offers they're considering?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Basically, when they use the seller multiple counteroffer, it means that the seller has received multiple buyer offers and is responding to all of the potential buyers that they wish to respond to. So
There's a difference in the seller counteroffer and the seller multiple counteroffer. The seller counteroffer allows the buyer the ability to agree to it, send it back, and have a fully executed agreement. A seller multiple counteroffer means there's multiple offers they counter to, and a buyer can agree to the multiple counteroffer, and then send it back, but it's not a fully executed agreement yet, because the seller still needs and has time to select which one of those counters that they want to get.
Right.
That's a big difference.
I think that's where I was confused, but I got it now. So I'm selling my house. I can consider and counter 4 out of the 10 offers I received and see which one counters back to my acceptance and accept only one.
Yep.
Okay.
Because the seller would be in hot water if all 4 of the buyers said, yeah, I'm signing it, sending it back.
Yeah. That's good. That's good to know.
So, and then I think we're done with the forms. I would just want to go through then, how do you get offers written in accepted in today's market? And Mark touched on it, but I will guarantee, and I'll revisit it now. I'll pretty much say, if you want to get an offer accepted today, you've got to have a good working relationship with that listing agent. And you need to call that listing agent and sell yourself as much as you're selling the buyer. John Fields was one of our top 10 agents last year. That's exactly his advice to you. You need to get in pretty much relationship with that listing agent even prior to sending the offer over, to let them know that I'm the type of agent that once we're in escrow, we're good to go. So the reason I bring this up right now, I had an agent call me today and asked me, they had an offer out, submitted, and he said, the listing agent called me back and asked me, how can you guarantee me that your buyer will close escrow on this property? That was a sign to me that this agent did not build a good enough relationship to pre-sell the buyer in those terms. So pre-sell the buyer, pre-sell your methods, pre-sell your systems you have in place. Talk about, if I'm working with a buyer and we're making an offer, my buyers are vetted that they're not going to go in and nitpick and ask for repairs and slow things down. I don't work with those type of buyers. That's the biggest concern for listing agents whenever they accept an offer. 1, does the buyer's agent know what the F they're doing? 2, is the buyer going to close on this property and not make this a nightmare transaction? And that's why I think John has the easiest transactions, because he's already built that relationship with the listing agent on the back end before they even got an escrow that says, my buyers aren't the buyers that are going to drag things out. We're going to meet our timelines. We're going to get the earnest money in on time. If I'm a listing agent, the first thing I've noticed that buyer hasn't even sent their earnest money deposit in within 3 days, I'm like, this is going to be a nightmare transaction. So there's only 2,100 units for sale in San Diego County. You've got to offer to bake them a cake at the end of escrow if they like cake, and bring it to them You got to stand out as being different, is my point on this. And if your offer is written so sloppily, guess what? If there's 20 offers that are coming in and your offer is sloppy, it's missing boxes, that one's going at the bottom of the pile. And if I didn't even get a phone call from you, I'll deal with you later.
Or you ask for something that just doesn't even make sense. Like you check the box that says HOA when there is no HOA. That shows the recipient listing agent that you really didn't look at the MLS and study the property. And I'd like to just add on to what Robert said about how John has developed these relationships. You're not just developing this relationship for this one deal that you're working on today. You're developing a relationship to work with that listing agent in the future. So keep that in mind, because the next property, next buyer that you represent, same listing agent, you reach out to them and they go, wow, that last transaction went really well with this agent. So that helps you a lot with your credibility with them to get your.
And it's a small community. Word travels fast, whether you're an agent that people want to work with or not work with. And how else do you get offers accepted? Well, you go to caravans. They're all virtual. If you have a buyer wanting to go to a particular area, like if you have a buyer in Chula Vista or Metro or whatever, they're all virtual. You should be showing up and pitching your buyer needs every week on that virtual caravan, because they are going to want to know what a little bit about you when you actually do make that phone call to them when they have a listing that they want to that they have coming to the market. Relationships are built at caravans as well too. That's how a lot of homes get sold. Anything I'm missing on that, Mark? Getting offers accepted?
Again, just we can't go over it too many times. Make sure you've got your pre-approved approval letter. You've got your proof of funds, that you send those with the offer, that the offer's complete and you haven't left things blank that need to be filled in.
Do not send an offer without pre-approval or proof of funds.
Yeah.
They won't even look at it.
In our market right now, yeah, that's exactly true. It'll, like Robert said, it'll go to the bottom of the stack,
And then ask the listing agent, what can I write that would put me in competition? Like the listing agent's not going to tell you exactly what to write, but that's how you phrase it. What offer can my buyers write to put me in a highly competitive advantage? Their goal is get their seller the highest amount of money.
Another option might be asking what special conditions or issues the seller might have. And if your buyer is has 2 months left on their apartment lease, you could say, my buyer doesn't need to move for 60 days. Does your seller need to stay in possession for any particular reason? So some of these things can be, can facilitate you being the accepted buyer, because it helps the seller.
All right, Yaneth had a question. She's had her hand raised.
You're on, Yaneth.
All right, next, Cal has his hand raised.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good afternoon. I remember you had said on Tuesday to raise the percentage of the loan. I think it was 0.25 when Ed was on. You said raise it. Is that right? 0.25?
In the section 1 of the contract where it discusses financing and the loan, yeah, put about a quarter point above what their pre-approval was at.
Okay, thank you.
So if they're approved at, God, I hate saying these. If they're approved at 2%, do 2.25.
And I'm sorry, real quick. Why again? I'm sorry.
Well, keep in mind again that is establishing the buyer's loan contingency parameters. And so it's done to account for fluctuations in the rate. And it's also done to, if rates go crazy and they go beyond what you established as the contingency, your buyer could cancel if they didn't want to proceed based on their loan contingency. So there's really two elements that come into play in putting a little bit of a buffer in there. Rate change and the establishing the contingency so that they could potentially cancel should they need to, based on they didn't want to buy or get the loan because it was too expensive.
Okay,
Even
and
though the listing agent will probably counter out loan terms, so
Yeah,
be a prevailing rate.
that's common in our practice right now. You'll see, a counter offer will come through. It'll say, loan to be at prevailing rates. And
Okay.
in the past, we've said counter back with a buyer to lock in rate and terms within 5 days, 7 days. But even now, that's probably not, great advice, because if they say prevailing rates, and our rates are actually relatively a little bit stable. So, the chances are if you've buyers well qualified, it's not going to be an issue.
okay, and did you guys say you were going to show us how to title it or type it in if they were going to buy the property in the name of the trust? I think you guys said that, or was that you said call you if that happened?
This is one of those things where you can't really advise the client because it has tax implications and legal implications.
No, he's talking about the RCSD.
Oh, I thought you were the method of holding title, like joint tenants or trust or whatever. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think you said you would. I think you guys said you would show us how to type it if they were purchasing it in the name of a
Okay.
trust.
Yeah, I have a little video I can send to you on that.
Okay, cool.
You gonna drop that in the chat box? Because we are almost done.
Let me find it and then I'll drop it.
Mark has a video, I have a paper. And it's in the KW Metro Google folder.
Okay, cool. I can look it up there.
How to do it in the name of a trust. And it's a visual. Mark likes, if you're good at needing paper, that's a good version to use it in. Mark has a video that if you're not a visual, if you're auditory, then that would be good.
All right, appreciate it.
Okay. All right, guys, we are done. We allot for 2 hours, but we never know how long the purchase agreement is going to go, because it can end up being a while. But that's it. If you guys don't have any questions, I'm assuming Yana has no questions, even though her hand's still raised. She must be dozing off in her recliner. Give me a bad time, Yana. All right, guys. All right, no other questions. You guys all have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks.